Okay. This was a long chapter. There's a ton packed into here. I mean, look, if we wanted to, we could just take this book right here, probably fill the entire semester with everything. I mean, plenty of discussion. In fact, just to make you guys feel really good, if I were teaching, missions in a seminary context on a master's level, I might actually use this book more on that level. There's a lot here, but I just think there's just really a lot of good stuff. Okay, so I want to hear from you guys. Evangelical missions in modern America, all right? So what are some observations? What caught your attention reading this? Miriam, here's a lesson in American history, really. There's a lot of American history in this chapter.
I thought it was really interesting how it talked about how things have kind of switched, like Christianity went from being like a Western religion to now the majority of Christians are in the two-thirds majority world.
Yes. He made an interesting statement in that light. He said that there is no central nation in the missionary endeavor today. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a really good thing. Jesus did not intend for any nation to be, the leading nation in missions. And if you were to ask me, what do you think is the leading nation in missions? I wouldn't know how to answer that question. I don't think it's possible to answer that question because God is using the center of gravity of missionary activity has gone really all the way around the world now. It's almost back to where it started.
I have a question about it. When you say that, you say like the center of missionary activity, is that like, or the first part of what you said, are you referring to like which country sends out the most missionaries or which country has the most missionaries?
Okay, I think I actually misspoke. The whole idea of the center of gravity of Christianity is not a mission statement. It's more of a where is the heaviest concentration of believers. Yeah, I said missions, but I misspoke. When we talk about Southern Christianity, then we're talking about where the greatest concentration, the greatest focus of believers is now in the world. And the reason for Southern Christianity is actually eastern part of the world, but most of it's below the equator. And that's why they call it Southern Christianity, okay? But if you look at that part of the world, Asia, there are areas above the equator, but below the equator, you've got, sub-Saharan Africa and India and, Thailand. We heard from Thailand this morning. I mean, a lot of those nations are in that part of the world. And so the focus of Christianity is really swung to that part of the earth today.
Along with that, like on page 112, it was just interesting reading how like there was like a huge growth in different Christians and thousands of people became Christians, but then like in the 1900s, there was about roughly 1/3 of the world's populations which were Christians, and then like a century later, though, it was still about 1/3.
Right.
And it kind of seems like there's been a switch to like other countries other than America and Northern weren't Christianized, and now like there are more Christians there, and like America's diminishing in Christians.
And that's the pattern we've seen throughout church history. There's a time when Europe was the leader, after the Protestant Reformation, they took the lead. And of course, England became very strong in its missionary output. And that's, and then people came here. And England today is a mission field. I mean, very much. It always has been, but it's very difficult now for Christians. Many would call Europe in general post-Christian. In fact, some people are referring to America as post-Christian, And that doesn't mean these other countries have become Christian. You understand that. There is, in fact, I don't think there's any nation on planet Earth that you can call a Christian nation. There are pockets of Christianity that are bigger in some places than others, but there is no Christian nation on the earth. Good. What else?
On page 113,
Yeah.
I've heard about like the First Amendment. I know like through like our like amendment rights, we have like freedom of religion, and like it specifically talks about the doctrine of religious freedom.
Mhm.
I never like realized or connected with the idea like because of that it opened up opportunities for like missions in America. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it did. Let me see, that's 113.
It's like the challenge of the modern. It's not fair.
Yeah, good. And obviously there was a lot of Christian influence even in the formation of those laws. Absolutely. Do you remember what existed before those laws came into being? What was the typical, what did Christianity look like in early America before some of those laws were passed? Like laws guaranteeing religious freedom and
Very dominated by like the city or country or whatever, like their rules.
well, yeah, I mean, the Puritans were very powerful, and the Puritans actually tried to establish more of a, what's the word that I want? A very institutionalized, controlled, Christianity where they were. And the Puritans were running the risk of becoming just like the Anglicans were in England, making, I mean, if you look at early American history, among the Puritans, people were hung, people were imprisoned because they didn't conform to Puritan expectations. I mean, they left England for that very reason. They come here and they do the same thing. And so some of these laws actually, help to eliminate that and create, and the reason I asked you what page that was is because if you look with me real quick, just on page 120, the title there at the top, that last word, disestablishment. Okay, did you catch what that word referred to? Missions in the American century, world wars, decolonization, and disestablishment. What did the author mean by disestablishment? Because it is related to what the comment you made, Matthew. Disestablishment from what? What's the establishment that is being disestablished?
My churches?
Yeah, but not the churches per se, but okay, the control of large, denominational control, and even sometimes, favors from the government in order to help a church or whatever. So disestablishment referred to more bringing the church back to a grassroots level, where those. In fact, the whole idea of raising support, to be a missionary, remember they talked about that? Under the more institutionalized form of church, the denomination paid, you went and you were, but with the disestablishment, you're breaking down the hierarchy, all the authority, and allowing the local churches to be what they really were intended by Christ to be. And so that's a good thing. So yeah, it's a lot of work to raise support to be a missionary, but we should thank God that we're able to do that in a context where we're not depending on the government for support. The Catholic Church was, others. So that's the idea behind that. And that was all good stuff. All right, what else? Good comments.
This is kind of a comment that like everybody knows already.
What page, John?
115.
Okay.
It just talks about like the Windy City and the fair and all the like
Yeah.
beautiful things that were there and attractions and like lure of progress and modern civilization. Just like it kind of states the idea that like people are walking away from Christianity because they're like consumed by all these like luxuries and things in the world
Mm-hmm.
and the new, I don't know, scientific discoveries.
Okay, do you remember, since we're on that page, he mentioned 2 or 3 things that happened in the U.S. that created some challenges, 3 challenges. Do you remember what those were?
Secular research.
Yeah. Universities that even had been, created even to, to teach the word of God and train ministers, that, are now promoting secular research and de-religionization. I can use that term. Right. What's another challenge?
Columbian expedition.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what she was referring to in
Oh,
Chicago
okay.
in 1893. That's right. That's right. Do you guys know that Chicago is called the Windy City? I don't know if they still refer to it as that, but yeah, when I was growing up, that's every time we mention Chicago, yeah, it's the Windy City.
What's that?
Pardon?
Just like actual wind?
Yeah, I think. But now, it's probably built up so much that a lot of, it's probably not any windier than Iowa. Yeah, it's off of Lake Michigan there. So I don't know. And then the third one, he said there were three, but I had a hard time locating the third one. He did mention in the next paragraph, the first parliament of world religions, and what did that bring about? What was the result of that parliament, that paragraph right after the second major challenge? What was the result of that parliament? In one word. What's the key word in that paragraph that starts for 2 weeks in the fall of 1893? There's a key word there.
Pluralism?
Pluralism. Exactly. What does he mean by pluralism here? What kind of pluralism are we talking about?
Is that like the idea of different religions working together?
Mm-hmm. Ecumenical ideas I think are involved in that. Mm-hmm. He talks about the happy pluralism of American culture, a spiritual relativism. That's another word. Anytime you have pluralism, mixing of different religions and culture, you're also going to have relativism. Does that make sense? What do we mean by relativism? What is relativism? And it's not your cousins and aunts and uncles, right? Relativism says, okay, what's good for me may not be good for you. You have your truth, I have my truth, right? And so if you try to bring a bunch of different ideas together, religious ideas or philosophical or whatever, there's going to be a watering down of truth because now you have all kinds of ideas and theologies coming together. And there's no way that each one of those groups can maintain their own. So, so pluralism tends to water down truth, and therefore truth becomes relative. Well, okay, it's good for me. I realize that you don't believe that, but I still want to work with you. That huge threat to the church, not just in America, but anywhere that happens. I think that's the third one, even though he didn't say so specifically there. And you also mentioned, Laurel, I think it was you, the prosperity, and was it you that mentioned that in America, and how that, becomes an issue as well. And that was also aggravated by the prosperity, gospel, the idea that if you serve Jesus, he'll make you rich and happy and heal you and all
Did that
that.
come out around the same time? I started that with the idea of religions work together and then they're trying to make Christianity more appealing or
I think that sometimes the motives were pure. For instance, in some missions movements, they came together because they said we got to reach the world, and we're not going to reach the world for Christ if we're all bickering about our doctrinal differences. Sounds really good, right? We need to stop arguing theology and get together, just love Jesus and serve him and reach this world for Christ. Fulfill the Great Commission, right? So it sounds good on the surface. The problem is God is truth. And so to sacrifice truth is really you're touching the character of God when you do that. And I think that pluralism, ecumenism, relative, all these kind of merge together. And part of that is because we live in a society where there's religious freedom, and religious freedom says you have a right to believe what you want to believe, and you can believe what you want, and I do. And if you're not careful, that can communicate to people that we really all are on the the same page. We're all working together, even though we disagree. You understand? It can communicate something we don't want to say. And so, but yeah, it's tricky. Living in a free country makes this kind of thing very, very, very appealing, but also very dangerous. Okay, what else?
On page 116, it talks, it starts talking about civilizing or Christianizing. And I think, like, later it says that they often, like, because Christians came from Western culture, they, like, have the idea that, like, they want to, like, civilize them, and that's also, like, Christianity. And I think Carrie said that in the article we had to read for our midterm, that if we Christianize people, no, if we share the gospel, they will automatically be civilized. I thought that was really interesting. Because they will, like, get a different idea about things, and then that will, like, happen automatically. And then also Hudson Taylor says on page 117, God's work in God's way will never lack supply. I think that's, like, good to keep in mind. Like, sometimes I think we're so focused on how to do it. Sometimes we just, like, have to do it the way we think is right, and God will use it, kind of.
Yeah. There was a statement also, let me see. Yeah, Miriam, if you look at top of 119, the very last sentence in the top paragraph, while it is always true that Christianity civilizes, it is never true that civilization Christianizes. You understand what the author's saying there? I think that's what you were pointing out. That's really true. Nobody denies that the gospel is going to have an effect on culture, but it has to be done that way. The gospel has to be the one making the effect, not vice versa.
Later, like, on page 119, it also says social reform is good, but it's not the gospel. Then education is good, but it's not the gospel. Like, we can use those things to share the gospel, but those things are not the gospel.
Right. Has any of you taken current issues of missiology yet? Okay. We talk about that issue. You know, we talk about holism and prioritism, and their holism is this idea, you know, what is actually part of ministry, legitimate ministry. And when the social gospel became very popular in the early 1900s, a lot of fundamentalists said, we don't even want to hear the term social gospel. I mean social, you know, work or anything, you know. So the word holism was really rejected by people who are fundamentalists because they were afraid of social work taking over. Okay, but I personally hold to a balanced view that the priority is the gospel. Okay, but that doesn't rule out social activity. Otherwise, we couldn't have missionary nurses and pilots, and you know, it would be wrong to send food to help people, or, you know, aid in an orphanage, you know, that sort of thing. Ella?
So when you say the priority is the gospel, does that mean, like, in missions, like, the priority is, like, sending church planters, or?
Okay, that's a really good question, and it's a loaded question. Okay, there's a lot to that question. Just to put it really succinctly, I think anywhere we take the gospel in the world, we should have in mind as an end game establishing of a church, because that's the institution that Christ gave us. That doesn't mean we can't have others. They're talking here about parachurch organizations that cropped up also later on after World War II, right? Camps, you know, they talk about Navigators and Campus Crusade for Christ and other groups that came up. But the church is the center of Christ's activity on the earth. I will build my church. And so I do think that should be the end game. And for me, to be legitimate missionary work, everything that a missionary does should somehow feed that objective, which is to establish the church. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean you have to be a church planter yourself, but what you're doing is in some way contributing to the establishment of the church. Bibles International, for example, translating arm of Baptist Missions, they will not engage in a Bible translation project where there is no established church. Why? Who's going to manage that translation and get it to people? They want to do it where there's an established church that can make use of that translation.
So like with medical missions then, would you say that a medical missions team needs to be with a local church?
That depends on the group, but there are groups, and I think Baptist Missions is one of them, where if you're a medical missionary, you should be working in an area somehow in conjunction with the establishment of a church. That doesn't mean that everybody who's a doctor or nurse also has to be a church planner. Okay, I think I've made that clear. But somehow what you're doing is aiding in the establishment of a church, because the church is the vehicle where discipleship is intended to take place. That makes sense, and that's a really, really important point that we make here at the college and in our movement. Good, that's a good question.
There's a sentence on page 117. Missionaries to Hawaii helped overthrow the monarchy and facilitated the annexation of the islands by the United States.
Yeah.
Not that you told us that missionaries probably shouldn't get involved with political things, but sometimes they did. So do you think that this was an example of, like, a good example?
Yeah, I wasn't even aware of that. I mean, I read this before, but the old mind doesn't remember things like it used to. Not that I ever had a good memory, but yeah, missionaries to Hawaii helped overthrow the monarchy in Hawaii. It was a king, it was a monarchy, and facilitated the annexation of the islands by the United States. It's hard for me to answer that question, Sharon, because I don't know all the nuts and bolts that were part of that, what kinds of things happened.
I never heard of that.
No, I had, in concept, I don't think that's a problem, because remember, the gospel can influence culture and even politics, as long as that's the way it's happening.
Mhm.
It shouldn't be the other way around. So, you know, and the fact is, we talked about success stories in the Pacific. Well, here's one of them. Hawaii was really a success story, if I can use that term. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that happened in concept. I don't know, like I said, I don't know about all the details that were part of that, whether everything would be above board.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's an example of something positive that can happen politically in the missionary endeavor. Yeah, so when I say be careful about involvement, I'm not saying it's wrong, just be careful, yeah. Yeah. Let me point out a couple of things near the end. I want to go to that last section where on page 122, Evangelical Missions from 1945 to 2000, because there are some things here I just really, really want to make sure we emphasize, okay? At the top of 123, I mentioned the word parachurch, okay? So what does the word parachurch mean?
Is it like an organization like partnered with a church, or like an outreach ministry?
Yeah, para is from Greek that means next to, alongside. So parachurch organization is a group, like for instance, Faith Baptist Bible College is a parachurch organization. Our goal is to come alongside and aid the church in preparing workers for the ministry. Christ didn't assign that to a Bible college, but the Bible college has resources and means by which it can help the church to prepare people for ministry. Mission agencies, same thing. Camps, same thing. College groups, he mentions some college ministries here. They're called parachurch organizations, all right? And he mentions a couple of mission boards that you probably never heard of before in the next paragraph. The Foreign Mission Association, Interdenominational Foreign Missions Association, IFMA. Interdenominational is pretty much the same as ecumenical. I mean, they're very similar terms. A lot of different faith groups involved. But I want to point out navigators, okay? Down in that paragraph that begins, there are dozens of examples. You see the word navigators there? Dawson Trotman was a big name back in the 70s. And he was a businessman that God used to start navigators. He did Bible studies with people in the military. Navigator, of course, is a kind of a military term. And that became a huge organization. Many, in fact, it still exists today. You can still find it. In fact, you ever heard of Nav Press? It's a publishing house, Nav Press, that's the navigators. When you get to the point where you can establish a publishing house, you know that you've gotten pretty big. Another one down at the very bottom, You've all heard of Campus Crusade for Christ? Maybe not, but Bill Bright, another huge name you should keep in mind. Today it's called CRU, C-R-U, okay? The reason for that in part is the word crusade is offensive to Muslims, because of the Crusades. So they didn't want to completely ditch the name, so they just call it CRU. Okay, I have a former student that's actually working for a Campus Crusade CRU down in Florida. She's actually doing it at Disney. She has a ministry in Disney there. Yeah. Kind of nice, huh? Any openings down there for
Do
that?
you know what denomination the
CRU,
is?
interdenominational.
Uh,
All, in other words, many Baptist, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, they can all be a part of that.
How do you like work together?
That's a good question. This gets back to this idea, what we talk about pluralism and relativism. You have to start watering down essential doctrines. And some have gone so far as to say the only essential doctrine is that we know and love Jesus. And that's really, really watered down, right? What does it even mean to know and love Jesus? So I personally would not be comfortable working in an interdenominational group for that reason. I'm not going to crucify them, but I would have trouble because I have some pretty strong convictions about what I believe the Bible teaches, and I'm not ready to surrender those. But it does make it difficult. But that's not to say that a lot of godly people, have worked with these groups. And Bill Bright was greatly used of the Lord. I can't deny that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think then, like, when Jesus comes back, all these denominations of people who are actually saved will have to work together? Do you think, like, all our theology that's not exactly correct will be figured out and then we'll all believe the same thing?
Yeah. When Jesus comes back to establish his kingdom, is that what you're talking about when he establishes his kingdom on earth? Now, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden everybody's going to be exactly theologically straight, but Christ, that's an interesting question because we don't know exactly how teaching is going to happen during the millennium. We do know that Christ is going to send out people who are going to be teachers. And so there's only going to be one theology, and it's going to be Jesus' theology. And during the millennium, there will be people coming in their natural bodies, right, who survive the tribulation. And they're not going to be perfect in their understanding. So there is going to be teaching. But we're living at a time right now where we're still under the curse and under the influence of the evil one. And that makes it difficult for correct teaching to take place. In the millennium, that's not going to be a problem. Yeah, and in the eternal state, we'll all believe exactly the same. We'll all be in our, perfect state. Yeah, it's a good question. Good question. Yep. And I've told you guys before, everybody in this room, if I were to ask you, what are the doctrines that you're willing to die for? Make a list and give it to me. Everybody would probably make a little bit different list. How important is premillennialism or pre-tribulationalism or, and so when push comes to shove and people are persecuted for their faith and they're trying to huddle together to encourage one another in Christ, what are the essential doctrines? Normally at a time of persecution, the list is a little bit shorter than it is in the time of prosperity when everybody can believe what they choose. It's interesting to think about. All right, I mentioned Bill Bright. Let me, a couple other things here that I just want you. John Mott is another name. He was head of the student volunteer movement. We've talked about the student volunteer movement, right? And oh, by the way, Bill Bright is the one that developed the 4 spiritual laws, top of 124. That's still a popular little gospel tract, the 4 spiritual laws. And it's okay for people that already have a foundational understanding of the Bible and Jesus and all that. But for those who don't, which is more and more of our population now, 4 spiritual laws aren't really going to do the job. Okay? But, he developed those. John Mott was really one of the leaders in the student volunteer movement. However, later on in his ministry, John Mott became very ecumenical, to the point where the social gospel became dominant for him. So it was not a good ending. He didn't end well. Okay. Billy Graham, who hasn't heard of Billy Graham? My father claims to have gotten saved during a Billy Graham crusade, they called him, on TV. You know, that he watched. And many, many people came to Christ through Billy Graham Evangelization Society. In fact, Billy Graham was so popular in our country that he said, if you want to write me a letter, he says, address it, Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's all you needed on the envelope. Now, you know how big Minneapolis is? But all you had to write was Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota, drop it in the mailbox and it would get to him. You know, no zip code.
Actually tried it.
Oh, yeah, he got thousands and, he got all kinds of mail.
No, for like with just that address?
Yes, that's all you needed. That's what they would advertise at the bottom of the TV screen. Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Everybody knew Billy Graham. The post office knew exactly where that mail was to go. Isn't that amazing? And by the way, in that book that you're reading, about 25 Marriages, I hope you're reading it, he and his wife are one of those chapters. I didn't include it, but fascinating read. She never stopped being a Presbyterian, and he was a Baptist all their lives. She never joined him as a Baptist. That's weird. It's really, really different. But it gets back to that, what are your essential non-negotiable doctrines, right? Yeah, very interesting. You should read that if you get a chance. But he started the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and one of the things that they did in missions that was very important for us to remember, and that's on page 126, is that second full pair. Well, let's start at the top. Graham and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association were responsible for one of the most important turning points in post-World War II evangelical missions, the International Congress on World Evangelization held in Lausanne, Switzerland. That is one of the most famous, and it is an ecumenical gathering of missionaries in missions history, in modern missions history. It was in 1974, okay? Here, the next paragraph, Lausanne marked the internationalization of evangelism. In other words, people began, that conference, for better or for worse, it really opened people's eyes to the need to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, which we should have already known from the very beginning, right? And remember that World War II also opened the eyes of a lot of people. Think of how many thousands, even millions of soldiers, were in other countries during the war. So they come back, and those who are Christians are saying, man, there's a need for the gospel in these countries. They've been there, and they see the need. That's why we encourage missions trips. Sometimes people come back from a missions trip and say, well, I just feel like God could use me there. And so Billy Graham he and his organization headed up that conference in Switzerland, Lausanne. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word correctly, but that's very important. Now, if you look in that same paragraph, near in the middle of it, it says, out of Lausanne emerged an ongoing agency, the Lausanne Committee on World Evangelization, which continued to coordinate world missions, taking as its motto, the whole church, taking the whole gospel to the whole world. Now, the big question there is, what do you mean by whole gospel? Okay, is that, that's a good question. All right, another guy, just really quick, Ralph Winter, down at the bottom of the page. Well, okay, yeah. Ralph Winter is very important. We're going to talk about him later on in the semester, so I think I'll let that go. But he was a think tank. He died about 10 years ago, I think, 10, 12 years ago. And so, man, there's more. This is a huge chapter. I wish we had.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Page 122.
Yeah.
One African leader said after independence, we need that moratorium so we can let what is Rice Christian in our midst die. We need time to peel off the foreign wrapper, find what the real message of God is for us. Like the rest of that. What does he mean by that?
Okay. Do you know what a Rice Christian is? Okay, there were missionaries in China that coined that term. What happened was there were some missionaries that went to China and they would pay Chinese to do ministry work. Okay, knock on doors, hand out tracts, they would pay them for that. But they would pay them with food, rice. Okay, staple, right, in the Chinese economy. And so some of those, and I don't even know if they were all even professing believers, but even those who were believers kind of got this idea that if I serve the Lord, I should get paid for it. And the missionaries, they brought them on themselves, right? And so that became known as Rice Christians. And so this guy says, the problem is, the foreigners came over and did that. We need to indigenize the work and get rid of the foreign influence so that our people can serve the Lord for the right reason. That makes sense? He's right. The guy is, where is that statement on 122?
Top.
Yeah. We need that moratorium. What moratorium? Notice at the top of the page, some forced what? Disestablishment. That's the idea. Get the establishment away. Let us work on a local level among our own people. And that was one of the things that they wanted to eliminate. Imagine the missionary turns over a church to a national pastor, and everybody that serves in that poor national pastor's church is expecting to be paid for his services. Teach Sunday school, I'm going to be paid. I'm taking the offering. I'm going to be paid. I'm greeting visitors. You know what I mean? So you always have to be careful as a missionary. You think you're doing favors for people, but you may be doing a huge disservice to the poor guy that's going to come and take over that pastorate after you're gone, right? And you want to remember that. And I'm sure that the Baptist missions missionaries had to be sensitive to that. Your dad comes on as a national missionary. The missions guys don't want to do something that's going to make it hard for your dad as a German to pastor the church after they've turned it over. And that's what this guy's talking about. Okay? Man, that coffee woke me up. I was half asleep all morning. And appreciate your prayers for conference. A lot going on. We do have class Monday. So we'll hit it again, but yeah, so much more here, but appreciate your comments. You guys do a good job. Have a good day.
I have a question about the 25 Marriages book. You said we should be reading it. We should just be reading the chapter.
Just the part of it you're going to do. Oh, yeah.
We
That's
can
a
read the rest of
huge,
it,
no.
but there's nothing else that's.
No. It would be, you would enjoy reading the whole
Yeah.
book, I'm pretty sure, but yeah. Not required. I wouldn't do that to you.
Thank you.
I know you know how to kick, so I wouldn't want to get you mad at me. Hey, did you see that picture I put up for you on the screen over there a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, for GRC.
Yeah. I hope I didn't mean to embarrass you, but I mean that was on the website.
Yeah. It was on what website?
Well, I think it was on the athletics page. I think that's where I got it from the website.
Sometimes Sean Lundberg posts those pictures.
Oh, he did, but he's a good photographer.
Yeah. There's a rain game we had last year. Pictures for that game.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
You're very welcome. Have a good day. Are we up to date on your internship? Where are we standing on that right now? Are we still at square one?
No,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if I want to go to the Dominican. And if that's like something, like there's some hesitancies and I'm trying to figure out if I'm just scared to go or if it's not where God wants me.
What about Ruth Coleman in, remember that one name I gave you?
Yeah, so I did look up some of them, like,
Okay.
was she the Honduras? Like,
Yes.
Honduras is like a very, very high crime issue right